Hi, my name is Ashlyn Anderson, and I am a sophomore undergraduate student here at the university. I am pursuing a self-designed major through the College Scholars Program, and my major is titled Food Security and Public Health Nutrition. The title of my research I'm going to present to you today is Interventions Addressing College Student Food Insecurity Across the Socioecological Model, a Literature Review. And I'd first like to mention that as a first-time presenter and someone new to research in general, I knew that whatever topic or field of research I wanted to pursue, that having an in-depth body of evidence on a particular topic is foundational. So that's part of the reason I decided to conduct a literature review and why I'd like to share my findings with you today. This literature review is on a topic that is extremely salient and particularly relevant to me as a college student myself. And this is the topic of college student food insecurity. And so, as a means of introduction of my initial interest in this research topic, I would like to mention how I read an article published by my research mentor in the Department of Nutrition. And her results found that 1 out of every 3 students is food insecure at the University of Tennessee and across the UT system. Essentially meaning that according to the USDA Food Insecurity Module, students were rating that they did not have enough food or food accessibility to have a healthy and active lifestyle. And so again, you can see here in this graph that 68% had high food insecurity, but that rest of the percentage was experiencing food insecurity. And this is an issue that I wanted to address and see what the literature had to say about this. So as means of background, I'd like to begin by introducing the definition of food insecurity according to the USDA. So food insecurity is defined as a lack of consistent and reliable access to sufficient, affordable, and nutritional foods to sustain a healthy lifestyle. Again, this has large implications for college students in particular, especially in terms of graduation rates, retention rates in school, and even mental health. Food insecurity has a large impact on the success of students in every facet of life. Also, this topic has had actually a very wide recent proliferation in the amount of articles, news media, and simply attention on the subject of college student food insecurity. And like I mentioned, because of these health implications for students, this is a public health priority. Finally, college student food insecurity rates are actually significantly higher than U.S. household national average, according to recent USDA data. It's a comparison of 11.1% on the household level to a range of around 43.5% among college students. And again, this is associated with factors such as poor health and financial and housing insecurity. So next you can see here my title once again, and I'd like to introduce my research question, which essentially drove my methodology as well as the scholarly context of my research, which was, given the response of many higher education institutions to address student food insecurity on their campuses, what research has been published on suggested and practiced interventions to combat student hunger? And how do these solutions align with various approaches according to the socioecological model? And so I would like to mention why I used the socioecological model within my research as a framework for interventions. So the socioecological model is a theory-based framework that's actually, I believe, based on my research, extremely necessary and critical to address the multidimensional issue of student food insecurity. This is actually a very widely used model in the field of public health, essentially because it visualizes the individual embedded within the context of their environment and being influenced by the following factors of policy, community, institutional, interpersonal, and again, individual behaviors. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the gap in the literature that I identified. So essentially, from the beginning of my literature review, I saw that a majority of the published literature was focused on the prevalence and the rates of food insecurity on campuses, simply from a statistical standpoint. However, there was a lack of studies that focused on interventions needed to address the issue systematically. So I view that as a gap in the literature, and my research builds on what systematic reviews and meta-analyses have already established, that being that college student food insecurity rates are extremely high, as I mentioned in the last slide, and that unique and systematic solutions are needed based on each level of this socioecological model. Finally, these interventions can be conceptualized as a multidimensional range of strategies. So again, it's not just going to be policy changes that address student food insecurity, but even behavior change on an individual level that is going to be necessary. So this brings me to my methods section. So as an independent researcher, I conducted a literature review and included peer-reviewed and gray literature according to the following eligibility criteria. These were articles must have been published and written in English and published within the years of 2016 to 2019. Now, a reasoning for this time frame constraint was to include the most recent modern evidence-based interventions for addressing college student food insecurity. Also, like I mentioned, the recent proliferation in the amount of studies that have been published have been since the year 2016. Also, the target population for these interventions had to have been college students within universities and higher education institutions in the United States. Within my initial findings, I saw that some studies included interventions that were in colleges and universities outside of the US, and I wanted to narrow that down to specifically focus on domestic solutions. Next, the research had to have reported on suggested, practiced, or evaluated interventions to directly address college student food insecurity. And the reasoning behind this eligibility criteria was because some interventions in the published literature were implemented but were not explicitly related to addressing student food insecurity. And so the studies that I found and included in my analysis all included an explicit mention of food insecurity among the students. Finally, peer-reviewed literature was extracted through the databases of Google Scholar, PubMed, and ScienceDirect, while gray literature, to broaden the scope of the interventions I included, was identified via Google and a citation review of meta-analyses. Moving on to the results section, 32 sources in all were identified. However, a total of 17 studies met inclusion criteria, and these 17 studies were included in the analysis. The research interventions from these 17 studies were then organized systematically according to the theme of the socioecological model. So again, these 5 are the policy level, community, institutional, interpersonal, and individual. Next, as a part of my results section, common themes were identified in addition to basic study characteristics and were categorized in tables, as you can see in the following slides. So Table 1 included the descriptive characteristics of these studies, and both from the peer-reviewed and the gray literature. So my table included both the author and publication date, simple characteristics of the study, such as the literature type, where the institution or organization was located, and the study design and intervention approach. Finally, I also wanted to include the context of food insecurity within the intervention because, again, that was part of the eligibility criteria, was that explicit mention of food insecurity and how that intervention was designed to address that. It is interesting to note, as part of the results, that 10 states were represented from various geographic regions among the 17 studies, again demonstrating the need for unique solutions that are local and sensitive to various contexts. And another result was that the most prevalent solution, including 8 studies, was included in the institutional level framework, and that category or that theme of those interventions was a food pantry. Next, in Table 2, I identified the major themes of these studies and systematically organized them according to level of the socioecological model. So I'm going to briefly overview these identified themes in the next slides. So for policy level interventions, some major themes were that centralized student services were needed for students to access federal and state resources all in one place. A major resource for students regarding food insecurity is SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And we know that SNAP is widely underutilized among students who could be eligible or should be eligible for the resource. And this is a concern considering that SNAP has the potential to address student food insecurity. So these studies discussed why SNAP eligibility rules should be expanded and how colleges and universities can do so. The next core theme identified was on the community level intervention. So I found that in these studies, community partnerships were critical to the success of interventions such as a food pantry or food bank. As you can see in this graph here, over 85% of donations from to a local food pantry are from community donations. This means partnering with grocery stores, with local farms, and building those community partnerships is an essential key to success in sustainable interventions. The next core theme identified was on the institutional level. And like I mentioned, 8 of these studies, a majority of these studies, included institutional level interventions. This is namely because of food pantries being administered and run by the university themselves. But I'd like to mention these studies found that food pantries are emergency aid and not only long-term solutions. So when food pantries were evaluated in these studies, many students identified many barriers to accessing this resource, whether it be the hours the food pantry is open or the social stigma that is attached with attending a food pantry and using that as a resource. These studies also found that pantries should and must act as a gateway to other community resources, such as SNAP, in allowing students to become enrolled in SNAP. And simply the role of the university is to offer these support to students. And on the interpersonal level, interventions, this included studies that talked about a text message delivery of nutrition information, as well as nutritional education courses, and building that community and that social network among students who identify as food insecure is critical to sustainable change and continuing to support these students in their lived experience. Finally, I'd like to discuss the findings from individual level interventions. So these studies focused mainly on behavior change and attitudes and perceptions of students who identify as food insecure. And what they found is that there are factors such as low confidence in their cooking ability, as well as the social stigma that affects access to resource and serves as a barrier for students to seek help. Finally, the psychosocial impact of food insecurity impacts not only academics, but every facet of life, including your social and relationship status. As you can see in this quote here, this was from an ethnographic study with food insecure and food secure students at a university. Finally, I'd like to mention my limitations for this research and the fact that it was not a systematic literature review nor a meta-analysis. Essentially, this means that I was not able to encompass all available literature published on food insecurity interventions among higher education institutions, and that my study was limited in its scope by my eligibility criteria and methodology. Some of my conclusions are that as colleges and universities seek to grapple with the high rates of food insecurity on their campuses, we must move towards evidence-based interventions. And this may mean not simply implementing a food pantry on the campus, but actually understanding how these interventions are conducted and the feedback students give for how it is impacting their lives and their lived experiences. The stigma and lack of awareness around food insecurity is extremely salient on college campuses, so we must change the narrative of a starving college student, maybe by normalizing these resources or, again, increasing the amount of evidence-based interventions on campus. Future implications for this research include high quality evidence, not only based on research, but establishing efficacy within a particular population and establishing rapport with students who may identify as food insecure, but again are hindered by this barrier of social stigma to seek support. So, my final conclusions are that, as the literature indicates, food insecurity is an extremely multidimensional issue that requires and necessitates interventions at every level of the socioecological model. Again, this is why the socioecological model is necessary as a framework for interventions when considering food insecurity. That means we must strive for food justice, which is possible based on the literature that I included in my review, and advocate for a movement beyond student food insecurity simply as a statistic, which is very prevalent in the literature, but rather as an infringement of student rights that can and must be addressed through actionable goals and evidence-based program development. And that program development is what I included in the studies of my literature review and saw is possible. Finally, I included my references section of the studies I explicitly mentioned in this presentation, and I'd like to thank you so much for your time to listen to my presentation, and I hope you have a wonderful day.